Welcome to Inspire Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower, educate, and inspire men in a positive way. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Inspire Change. I made a decision the other day and I decided I was going to spend this particular episode talking about peace and what it is. Now, partly this was sparked off by a client, and as he and I were sitting in the session together working on some of the issues that he was confronting, he suddenly stopped and he looked at me quite intensely and he said, "You know, I'd like just to get a sense of peace." And I was intrigued by that because most of the time, most people ask me, about being happy. How do I achieve happiness? And, that in of itself is an interesting discussion. And we've had a couple of episodes in the podcast where I talked about this issue about happiness. But it's not often that I get somebody who says to me, "I just want to have some peace." So I decided that I'd do what I usually do, and that is to try and get a sense what this person actually meant by the word peace. And so I said to him, "Well, that's an interesting observation. What is it that you're looking for? What is it that you want under that heading of peace?" And he looked at me for a moment and he went, I don't know. It's just that I've constantly got this sense of having to be on the go, and when I am, I never quite feel satisfied." And so I thought, well, that's really, really interesting because he's actually in touch with something very, very important. Okay. So in today's podcast, I'm actually going to talk about the notion of peace, and I'm going to come at it from a couple of angles. Okay, so I'm going to take it up from what I felt and what my client and I will eventually were talking about, which is that notion of inner peace. Some people refer to it as contentment. Some people might even put it under the heading of satisfaction. All right. But I want to unpack that a little bit more broadly and actually look at what we are talking about from a psychological, psychotherapeutic point of view about peace, inner peace. But the other thing that I want to draw in is this whole notion of social peace. And it was really interesting because, as I often do, is when I've got a sort of topic that I want to explore, I'll just go to Google and I'll just throw the keywords into it. And in this case, it was simply peace. And sure enough, Wikipedia, in all its brilliance and sometimes inaccuracies, popped up with its entry on peace. And it too talked about essentially, two types of peace. That whole idea of psychological peace, as they put it, and then the other part, which is about the concept of a societal friendship and harmony in the absence of hostility and violence. So, using that little framework, I think I'm going to take it up from there and talk about my view. And firstly, I'm going to start off with that whole notion of inner peace. Now, as a trained psychotherapist, one of the things that we look at in someone's psychological presentation is, the notion of fragmentation of the self. Okay? So there's, in Gestalt therapy, for example, the idea is that we're born whole, and through socialization, our personality, our self, becomes fragmented. And it fragments in a number of different ways. And part of therapy is to focus on integrating that more. Now, Carl Jung also talks about this idea of integration, but he talks about, the persona. He talks about the shadow. So there's a whole range of concepts. Now, I'm friendly towards Jungian psychoanalysis, although my big issue with it is it's this fantastic metaphor in some ways, but it's not scientifically verifiable, for example. And similarly, some of that criticism can be laid at the door, for example, of most psychotherapies, most dynamic psychotherapies. Okay. But we're getting better at it. And for instance, in attachment theory, we both have the scientific evidence for it through a whole range of very sophisticated technological examinations and the results that we get from that. And it supports a lot of the sort of knowledge base, or what we used to think of as only theories, um, that have now some empirical evidence. Attachment is one of them, and the process of attachment. So let me start off with what I think is a particularly useful framework in that whole notion of fragmentation. Okay, so why is it that some of us have less inner peace than others? And we can put that into a number of categories. And in Gestalt therapy, one of the ones that we talk about is the notion of unfinished business. In other words, I'm going to talk from my perspective. I have some unfinished business, and that means that I've got a lack of ability to gain closure on some of the issues. That might be about my relationship with my mother or my father, or it may be to do with some unfinished business in the relationship. But again, the notion of closure is important here. So if I'm going to resolve that fragmentation at that level, I need to pick out my unfinished business, and I need to sit down and I need to look at how I'm going to finish this off. One of the things I'm very particularly aware of, both in myself, but I'm also in my clients, is that unfinished business can often come back to bite us. Sometimes it's conscious, but a lot of times it's actually an unconscious process. In other words, it's outside of our state of awareness. And as I've spoken before, especially, in most dynamic therapies, awareness, self-awareness is actually a fundamental cornerstone in self-understanding and being able to process, what I need to process, and therefore gain a greater sense of emotional maturity and ultimately integration. Okay, so that's unfinished business. The second one is that, we are truly talking about a fragmentation of self. But in that process, it's often also about denial of self or aspects of self. So I could, in Gestalt, we talk about split parts. And some of you might be going, oh, are we talking about multiple personalities in someone's psychological frame? And probably it's possible. Okay, now multiple personalities aren't that common. They're usually definitely a product of some severe trauma. Okay, now I'll give you a very simple example of something less severe, and that is people who are always really, 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 really friendly. Well, you can put money on it that somewhere along the line they're sitting on a pot of resentment or anger or, in fact, rage. Okay, but they're not in touch with it. And somewhere along the line, that potential resentment and rage is going to burst through. And it often catches the person experiencing this completely by surprise. And at that point, it's often a little bit too late because the horse has bolted. It quite literally, has escaped into the paddock, and then, it requires some fairly serious reparation. Okay. Now, the other aspect is, the sort of, either or. Like, I'm either a good person or I'm a bad person. So we're talking about winning, losing, um, sometimes conflict of values, but also about top dog, underdog. Okay, so in Freudian terms, it's the struggle between the superego and the id. In other words, the primitive self of the id, impulse driven, needing immediate gratification, and the superego, which is basically going, oh, you're being very naughty here. It's the moral overrider, the sort of, in Eric Burns' transactional language, it's the critical parent over the wounded child. But we do all have, in a sense, representationally, that idea of, the parent in my in my psychic structure, the adult and the child. And the real conflict often, occurs between the needs of the child and the demands, the expectations and values of the parent. So, if the child crosses the parent, there's a great state of anxiety. And that's one of the key issues about this whole thing is that um, fragmentation leads to anxiety. In the old language of psychoanalysis, we talk about fundamentally neurosis. So polarities also are a part of this process of fragmentation. So extremes, the good self versus the bad self, or the compassionate versus the selfish, and it's trying to find a middle path with that. And so a lot of work often in therapy is to reconcile the fragmentation of myself into a more whole, into a greater whole. Part of that means letting go of judgments. Now, that's really, really important. Now, why is that important? Well, and here's the link, because if I am not at peace in myself, the chances are that I'm going to have a very, very difficult experience in my relationships with others. And we sort of project this onto my environment. Okay, so if we look at people like Adolf Hitler, Adolf Hitler was not at peace in himself. This is a man with a deeply, deeply disturbed psyche, completely fragmented, with a deep seated rage. And, given the opportunity which he got, he projected that rage onto the world. And so we had World War II. Okay, now there's probably lots of examples, lots more examples of how that works in probably a less dramatic way. So I won't go any further into the whole Adolf Hitler story, but I want you to really appreciate the link to the notion of social peace. Now, if I come back to that idea that it's about societal friendship and harmony, how can I be harmonious with someone else or in another context when I'm not in a harmonious, well aligned relationship in myself? It doesn't make any real sense. Now, I think the question we need to ask at this point in terms of social peace is it simply the absence of war? Now, my argument is that that's not the case. I think a healthy society that is at peace will have recognized the fragmentation within it and the path to reconciling and beginning to integrate that internal fragmentation. In other words, we become more inclusive of all those aspects that we sort of try to either disown or to push aside or to not even acknowledge, to deny. If for example, as an individual, I have an addiction, which means that somewhere my attachment needs haven't been met, so I'm a very dependent person, but I pretend not to be, and I ultimately, in order to resolve my anxiety, resort to something like alcohol to sedate myself, to feel okay, even if it's only temporary. We have a dynamic here that obviously begins to highlight um, emotional, psychological uh, dis-ease. This is where the idea of dis-ease is actually really, really important. So inner peace and social peace need to connect, and it's not just simply because there's no tension, there's no war going on. It's more than that. Okay, in my view, the whole issue in terms of social peace is firstly, how well do we deal with the conflicts between the fragments in our society? Do we push them further apart, or do we look to integrate them? Do we look to include those who on the surface don't appear to fit? So we don't want necessarily a society that has this internal state of anxiety. And at the moment, in many countries, there is this persistent, increasing level of tension between all these polarities, these um, fragments of the culture floating around, with not really a process to bind them together. And this is where, if we're going to be healthy individually, that's when we can start to look at how to make the society healthy. But right now, we're really, really struggling with that. And, again, if you want a healthy relationship, you need to firstly, fix the relationship with yourself. Because under pressure, if that relationship with self is not reconciled, is not integrated, then we cannot feel comfortable within the society, even when that society fundamentally is fragmented itself. Because ultimately, when it boils down to it, is if I have a sense of inner peace, no matter what happens outside of me, I'm not likely to be rocked to the core and act out with hostility, with aggression, with violence. I just don't allow myself to get there. And I think this is a particularly important message to men at a time when the whole notion of masculinity has also been fragmented, where it's really confusing for everybody who is male, and even for women who are looking towards men and trying to understand men, what that really means. It certainly doesn't mean hypermasculinity. Most men that I've worked with who've tried to resolve their inner conflict of a lack of sense of self-worth, a lack of purpose, and so on, by becoming hypermasculine, are not at peace. Recently, a dating guru killed himself. Now, he was a huge promoter of men's sort of well-being and the capacity to be confident and to put your demons at rest by being, a dominant alpha male who has great success with women and, who's generally, a presence, a leader. If that was truly part of his core being, he would not have, in my view, committed suicide. Suicide is I want to cease to exist the way that I am. And unfortunately, people who get into that space take their life rather than going, maybe all I need to do is psychologically put the person that I'm currently working around to rest and become anew. It's a phoenix from the ashes scenario. So there's some real food for thought in that. And particularly, I want everybody to reflect on, am I at peace in myself, the psychological peace? How do I think and what do my emotions reflect? And I think that the other part of it is, the idea of, do I act into the world with peaceful behaviour? Do I have an inner connection where I can stay calm and collected in the face of adversity? or do I get drawn into the addiction of aggression and rage? So on that note, I'm going to finish, and I will hopefully have you as my company next week for another topic on inspiring change.
Gunter Swoboda does individual and group coaching for men looking to grow. For more information on this and the global Making Good Men Great movement, check out goodmengreat.com. If you have a topic for the show or would like to be a guest on the air, please email miranda@nortainment.com. That's MIRANDA at NOIRTAINMENT.com. Thank you, and always keep inspiring change.